you have to understand the patient, and you have to understand what happens in an actual clinical setting. But ultimately, you have to understand that because you're really developing a capability and a tool for drug discovery and maybe translational science, right? And so, in a way, you really need to understand their issues and what are the limitations of their tools today. Primarily lab models, animal experiments, etc. And you need to develop something that actually really is useful for them.
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and on this episode I have a conversation with Szabi Nagy, CEO and co-founder of Turbine, an AI-focused drug discovery company based in Hungary, which has raised a 25 million euro Series A and has had several partnerships with large pharma. Before joining Turbine, Szabi previously launched a cybersecurity startup, which was subsequently acquired, and worked with several medical blogs, including The Medical Futurist, as the Chief Strategy Officer. We're so grateful to have Szabi with us on the Nucleate Podcast today to learn more about his experience as a founder and raising money in a challenging financial market. I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, Szabi, thank you so much for joining the Nucleate Podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I mean, this is a great chance to, let's say, impart some of my, hard-earned knowledge to some folks who may, do some great stuff with it. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I think your story will resonate with the founders in our audience, especially. So let's start with your background. You're based in Hungary, and you studied international business at the University of Budapest, and you also studied biomedical engineering management. Curious on how you decided on that and what brought you to focus on science in the first place.
Yeah, the funny thing is that actually I have been trained as an economist, but the biomedical part isn't really like official, right? I never went to school to study biomedical engineering. It really was more an organic interest that grew out of my first sort of rodeo when it comes to startups, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. But I had experience launching a cybersecurity startup out of university, which I really enjoyed, and it was based on university IP. So what I really enjoyed was trying to figure out what to do with something super complex and how to turn that into a real product that actually solves a real need for actual people and businesses. But I wanted to do that in a much more meaningful arena, which to me was sort of, healthcare. I wanted to work on something that at the time I felt would sort of make me cry, with tears of joy if I actually made a dent in that business. And I felt that healthcare could be that. And so I started looking for potential co-founders and eventually found my current sort of partners and teammates 10 years ago today. And I sort of learned on the job. So everything was, a steep learning curve initially.
Yeah, that's great context. And I want to dig in a little bit more into your first startup before we get into Turbine, which I want to focus most of the conversation on. So for your first startup, it was a cybersecurity startup. You said you started in college. That's really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that company came to be in the first place, how you started it, and what it was focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was in a way saved by my then co-founders from a life of consultancy because I wanted to be a McKinsey man, and I felt that was an amazing idea. In university, I did all the things, case study competitions and attending all the events they ran, and I wanted to actually start, a career in management consulting, but luckily, a friend of mine who actually was part of some of the teams that we went to case study competitions with internationally, he asked whether I would be interested in helping grow a new company that he was launching with a few friends out of a technical university over here in Hungary. And that turned out to be what we eventually called Tresorit. And it was essentially a business-to-business cloud security startup. I think it was launched in 2011, 2012. And so the idea was that I would come in and grow that. And just as with Turbine, I had absolutely no idea how to do startup, a growth essentially for a B2B sort of enterprise solution in cybersecurity. But I really enjoyed the experience of working with the engineers and trying to understand what the hell was it that we were doing differently, and then talking to users and trying to sort of connect the two together. And that is essentially what then sort of taught me some of the core lessons that helped really catapult Turbine to the world stage eventually.
That's really interesting. And obviously starting a company is hard no matter what industry it is. I would assume that your first company as a cybersecurity B2B startup, probably a lot faster than anything that's done in the
Oh yeah.
biotech world. I'm assuming it's a lot easier to develop a prototype, get it to market, test it, all of those things. It's not so easy to prototype a drug, or in your case, like an AI development engine. So I'm very curious to hear what were the similarities so far that you've been seeing from a B2B enterprise cybersecurity company to what you're doing now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think it's a bit bimodal because there were lessons I learned at Tresorit that really helped in the initial years of Turbine, and then lessons I learned that actually today are coming to the fore now that really, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk a bit about this, but we're now at the inflection point really of the go-to-market for Turbine, where we announced some great partnerships. We have real momentum now where people are looking to use the stuff that we've developed, which is essentially a virtual cell, virtual biology platform. And now it looks a lot more like the B2B SaaS experience I've had at Tresorit previously. But in the initial years, really what was, I think, very, very useful as a learning was like all the kind of mistakes that we made at Tresorit, right? I mean, because we launched at, it was a very strong founder vision actually for something that eventually became sort of the norm, which was end-to-end encryption for, business data and just any kind of communication data. And, eventually WhatsApp and other technologies and platforms made this sort of accepted, right? It's something that you get on iPhone and a lot of other platforms today. But at the time, it was sort of a new idea, right? And it was this very technical pitch that the real, crypto nerds really understood. That's cryptography nerds and not crypto nerds, but so they really understood, but the general population, especially in B2B, didn't really see the benefit of. And so we absolutely made that mistake that many make as a founder, where you follow your own vision but you kind of are not really the end user that eventually will pay for this. And so you're building for yourself, but the guy that should be paying you for it doesn't actually care about what you built. And we've absolutely had that. And the lucky thing was that Tresorit managed to raise some nice rounds, for Hungary at the time, and so that allowed us sort of that, let's say, 3-year runway to really figure things out and start dialing it in. Yet, for example, figure out that we're not a consumer product, but we're actually a B2B product, which initially was absolutely not the idea. And all of those actually showed me that what we really needed to do, especially when I joined Turbine, which was, super science first, some very wacky science that's applicable to a dozen different fields. But I at least knew from the Turbine experience, I'm sorry, that Tresorit, I'm not sure why I picked two TR, like two names with TR. But anyways, so the experience was at Tresorit that we really needed to figure out who the user is and what the problems are. And so at least when we joined Turbine together, we were able to focus on the user need much more and much earlier. And I think that ultimately meant that we got to a better product now that it's really becoming a product. So I think that was, for example, one of the key lessons early on. And I think like another lesson that is more personal was very much important was that experience that ultimately at Tresorit I failed, right? So I was the growth guy. I was the first like non-founder chief, whatever, right? Whatever that means in a team of 20, right? But I was the chief marketing officer officially. And I couldn't actually grow the company fast enough, and we weren't successful for a while there, right? After the first couple of years, it really took off, but then didn't really find product market fit. And I learned a lot about how I operate as an individual, right? And what are some of the core mistakes that were actually dearly held beliefs of mine, but it ended up sort of hamstringing the team that I was leading and also the company to some extent. And those really stayed with me. And I think ultimately, I'm not saying I was immediately able to become a better man, but at least I managed to sort of learn from those experiences and experience failure early on that made some of the other risk taking more bearable later on.
Got it. So the two things I think that really stood out to that story is one, like really understanding, in the case of Tresorit, understanding product market fit, and in the case of Turbine, which is more developing, medicines and AI tools to ultimately make medicines, it's understanding the who is the end user. In the case
Oh yeah.
of biotech, it's going to be a patient, right? So understanding what the needs of patients are, having that mindset, and then sounds like understanding yourself as a leader. Those two things are pretty universal to understand.
Pretty universal. And also, I mean, now that we're really thinking about go-to-market, we're actually turning the Turbine platform that was used, internally for years and years, essentially to solve drug discovery problems. But now we're turning it into software, essentially, that the scientists on the other side in biopharma can use. Now a lot of the learnings about launch plans, go to market, marketing, those are suddenly much more applicable. And also product, I think, like a lot of the learnings about product are applicable, so those eventually became useful. But for a while it wasn't really, like, that wasn't the biggest bottleneck and the biggest risk in Turbine that we had to control. It was much more essentially the question of whether you can even make this work and you can have something. And I will say one more thing is that, interestingly, you are right that you have to understand the patient, and you have to understand what happens in an actual clinical setting. But ultimately, you have to understand that because you're really developing a capability and a tool for drug discovery and maybe translational science, right? And so, in a way, you really need to understand their issues and what are the limitations of their tools today. Primarily lab models, animal experiments, etc. And you need to develop something that actually really is useful for them. And I'll touch on this later if we get to it. But I think that was actually a very important learning that we feel that is actually an advantage now in this particular moment in time in this market.
Absolutely. So let's talk about how you, like, we're alluding to Turbine. Let's start talking about it a little more detail. So how did you go from your cybersecurity startup? I know you also had some other roles in marketing before starting Turbine. So I would love to hear about, and you alluded to this, like crying tears of joy if you made something successful. I'm curious on how you ultimately made that pivot, because it is a fundamentally different field. It sounds like your technical experience was more it wasn't biologically oriented. So curious on how you made that pivot.
Yeah. So essentially, when I agreed with the Tresorit founders that I would eventually step down, right, as a chief marketing officer, then I started thinking about, like, what is it that I would rather do, right? And there was a transition period during which I got to really think about it. And I had a sort of a chance encounter with somebody that's actually the leading influencer on LinkedIn and other platforms when it comes to essentially healthcare. I mean, he's called the medical futurist, and he's a Hungarian dude, but is looked at as a sort of international sort of thought leader, speaker, etc. And I had a chance encounter with him, and I essentially offered to work with him initially for free, just so I could start learning more about this field. And during that time, I started looking for interesting science in academia around Hungary, right? When it comes to healthcare, like with healthcare applications. And I knew that I needed something that had sort of an IT or software component to it, because I felt that that would be the most relevant and the most interesting for me based on the previous experience I've had at Tresorit. And so I spoke to maybe a dozen or so teams. Some of them were already, running startups. Some of them were just academics. And actually, like, one of my childhood friends randomly put me in touch with my eventual co-founders at Turbine. So essentially, it was somewhat structured mapping of the space and the potential co-founders I could actually really help, who brought the technical know-how and the really cool science, but really haven't yet sort of traveled that startup journey, even the initial couple of years that I've had experience at that time. And when we met with the Turbine founders, Daniel and Krish, CSO and CTO respectively, even today, we sort of really felt that spark. So we fell in love when we met. It was a bar called the Pulse next to the medical university, and it was clear that none of us really spoke each other's languages, but I could see on them that they feel that they're onto something really cool, and they could sort of feel that I was pretty excited to actually like help them out, and I've had some somewhat transferable learnings. And so we felt that, okay, it's a good enough sort of foundation to start working together on. And that led to actually years of bootstrapping together. So we spent the first couple of years really trying to understand where to apply the core technology that was developed by the guys, and where we could take it together, who were the ultimate end users. And I can talk, of course, more about what that core technology was and what it became today, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, let's jump into that. Let's talk about the core technology. And for folks not familiar with Turbine, can you just give a brief picture on what you all are doing and what your mission is?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, what we do at Turbine is virtualize biological experiments using AI, which we've really architected to learn some of the fundamental rules of how biology works on the molecular level, and how all of those complex processes ultimately form, essentially a mechanism that is the cell, and then more complex sort of tissue level organizations. And we've developed this to be able to essentially take experiments and virtualize them, which allows for two things for drug discovery and development scientists and experts. One is that they can essentially take something that they could do in a lab, but make it computational speed and scale, right? So you can essentially take a CRISPR screening experiment, like an assay where you test drug sensitivities, drug modifier screen, something like that, and essentially you can turn it into something that you can run instead of like weeks or months in a couple hours maybe. But instead of testing a couple thousand or maybe tens of thousands of perturbations and hypotheses, even in the more scalable sort of assays, you can run 100 million experiments in that time, in that couple hours. And by doing that, you as a scientist, of course, can essentially just travel a larger research space, and you can test more ideas. So when you start narrowing down to your core hypotheses, or strongest hypotheses, you actually have a longer list to choose from. Plus, because the simulations are, you could say perfectly noble, you can learn more about what happens to your cells and biological models in those experiments. What exactly is the result of that perturbation that you apply to them, either through CRISPR or a drug or a combination of these two. And so you, in a way, have a better understanding of the molecular events that transpire after you make that perturbation, and that can give you a better hypothesis for a mechanism, a biomarker, and ultimately you can better judge the translatability and the relative strength of these things that you see. So that's one advantage. And the other advantage that we hope eventually will really be sort of the killer application of these simulations is that you can run experiments that you cannot run in a lab, and definitely run them at much greater scale than even if you can make them work in a lab setting. It's going to be much more finicky, and sort of your let's say experimental scale is very much limited. And this is something that we're now, for example, showing with Merck, where what we announced for the scope of the collaboration is essentially that we're building simulated versions of cancer types that exist in the patient population, but that are not really represented well in the laboratory models that any scientist has access to. And of course, as a very resource organization, Merck can try to engineer models that better represent those patients, but even Merck cannot engineer thousands and thousands of model systems before they know what they're looking for. And so what we're showing is that we can essentially in simulations create a better model of the patient than what you have in a lab, and that will give you the insight that you then need to confirm this in a very resource intensive and unscalable experiment. And ultimately, we think that this second advantage is really what will help us transform certain biological research processes across biopharma.
That's fantastic. And to summarize, maybe oversimplifying a little bit, but in essence, what you're doing is you're simulating key biological experiments and systems, and allowing users to, in effect, test many different drugs earlier on at scale, far more than you ever could in a lab setting. So this would allow for speedier selection of the most optimized version of a drug, for example. And as you said in that second example, also allow for new types of simulations that you wouldn't really be able to test at scale in the lab anyway. So it allows to my understanding, you would be effectively speeding up the earlier side of the development process, optimizing a drug more quickly and efficiently than you ever could in a lab. And I'm assuming it still has to translate into lab results. You still have to, it speeds things up, and then you can, move back and forth between simulations and lab settings. And then basically it really speeds up the early drug design development process.
It does a couple of things, but you put it really well. But it does a couple of things. Essentially, there's, let's say, three main phases of application for it, and there's a sort of a fourth that we hope to develop over time as well. So first application is you're looking for new program, a new target, and you essentially want to find something truly novel, or you really want to make sure that you de-risk that target or that set of targets that you're looking at. And so essentially we allow you to run ultra high throughput simulated target ID screens. They allow you to run a lot of the experiments that you would eventually run in the real world, but you can run them at scale and much earlier, so you can look for potential, tox. You can look for potential biomarkers. You can look for potential combination potential, and even run sort of head-to-head studies with your potential target of choice and a whole host of sort of investigational compounds, standard of care, and that allows you to build a much stronger data package essentially around a novel target, and it really allows you to make the right bets at the very earliest stage of your discovery process. In the next phase, we help you, when it comes to essentially hit ID, hit to lead optimization. Essentially, we allow you to, as you said, better select the right program, and again, sort of prioritize programs vis-a-vis each other, so you really know what exactly is the potential patient population of a certain program, a certain compound, what exactly is the combination potential, and you can really essentially set yourself up for maximum success in the clinic in that sort of discovery phase. And then finally comes the translational phase, where we can already be applied to sort of one part of the problem, and then the second part is what we'll be developing. But the first part is essentially helping you select the right patients for those initial trials, setting yourself up for success in sort of a phase one extension setting, and and essentially allowing you to identify the right biomarker, stratify your patients well, and make sure that you enter the clinic with the right approach, the right focus. And then what we hope to develop is essentially the ability to then take those initial trial results and sort of translate forward to that's a phase 2, phase 3 pivotal trial design, and help you really sort of dial that in the most, based on the early and of course very sporadic data you have in the patient setting, as well as everything else that you've generated prior to that in animal models as well as cell-based systems.
Got it. So it's really across all aspects of development, right? From the very earlier stages as well as through the clinical stages. That's fantastic. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is how you built the model in the first place. What is the foundational data sets that you used, and how did you train, without getting into anything proprietary, but ultimately what were the types of data sets that you used to build the model to make sure that it's accurate? Obviously, you guys are simulating many millions of experiments. How did you build the data set so that you have confidence that these are going to play out in the real world?
So we had sort of two fundamental tenets when we started building Turbine, and these have stayed with us since then. One was that we wanted to build a model that was able to generalize to sort of eventually any disease, any cell type, and even more complex tissue level effects, right? And so we didn't want to create a model that was great at predicting how a very narrow set of cancer types would respond in vitro, but we wanted to build something that can start with that, but is really architected to actually do all the other stuff to predict, how immune cells would behave when perturbed in a certain way, how all of these different cell types would come together to form essentially tissue, to understand the microenvironment and all that. And so that was a key tenet. And the other tenet was that we wanted to make sure that we would work with what's out there and not try to, let's say, create the ideal data set, but rather we would set up a workflow to tap into as many disparate types of data as exist in the public domain, in our own data generation with the partner, and actually bring all of that together to really train a single model that could do the generalization. And this was important because, and of course, this was also in a way a factor of our background and where we came from, because of course we came from an ecosystem, in Hungary, where there wasn't like a copious amounts of funding for something as crazy as, virtual cells and simulating biology, especially when we started, about 8 to 10 years ago. And so we were kind of forced to build a really scrappy and like data efficient system, but one that is really architected not to look for interesting IP in existing data sets that we may generate from like significant investment, but it would be able to simulate new experiments that it hasn't yet seen in its training data set. And this was something that led to a certain architecture. It sort of led to us spending an insane amount of time really even figuring out how do you assess a model's ability to generalize to truly hard but actually useful questions, like a new experiment in a new disease model with a new perturbation that you haven't yet maybe trained on. And it also forces us to really focus a lot on the very unsexy but actually pretty pivotal work of harmonizing a ton of different data sets and learning how to piece all of them together, so we can actually take whatever a data set from a pharma partner where they tested a certain drug on a couple dozen cell models, and we can actually take that, combine it with everything else that we've built into our main training corpus, and still actually predict interesting things and have good results on and good performance on that particular compound in the sort of indication of their choice, so, or even across indications. And so that's what we were optimizing for, and what sort of that led to was a system that essentially takes in data from now multiple different, let's say, sources or levels of biology. So we have cell-based data, we have more complex systems like organoids and PDXs, and we also now have increasing amounts of patient data. And essentially what we're trying to do is generate, especially in-house, more and more in vitro data that sort of forms, let's say, we call it the seed data set, to be able to predict in a particular type of experiment. So that could be, let's say, ADC payloads tested on certain cell models, or it could be certain small molecules tested in organoids. And so essentially we're generating these seed data sets in-house. We're essentially bringing in more and more data from data partners. So folks like, for example, Champions Oncology, we just entered collaboration with MSK. And so we're gathering data from those who have them, combining it with our targeted data generation. And then we're really setting up to be able to take in data also from partners in pharma that may be a much smaller data set often, but actually we can use it to sort of fine tune the system. And the data really is typically, it's multimodal, but what it really is essentially pre and post perturbation snapshots of all of these various systems, using as heterogeneous a set of disease models as we can possibly get access to, and also a very heterogeneous set of perturbations, right? So it's not just CRISPR, it's not just a certain type of drug, but essentially it's a large mix and hodgepodge of various perturbations, because we're trying to, again, set the system up to be able to predict not just a single modality, but across modalities, not just a single disease model, but across disease models. And that's ultimately the core model itself. And on top of this, we've built something we call the virtual lab, which is essentially the way our own in-house biologists also use simulations and have used for over 5 years in live pharma discovery collaborations. And that virtual lab is essentially the, let's say, interface for a biologist, not somebody that is an expert at machine learning, for example, to be able to set up a well-predicting model of certain disease models and biologies, and then actually run simulated experiments on that, and then interpret the results and come up with an actionable hypothesis that they can directly take to the lab, which, for example, in-house is sort of hooked up to the system in a way that we can almost automatically launch validation efforts and then feed that data back into, then improve the model further.
Got it. That is really helpful. And you've already alluded multiple times to the partners that Turbine has. I want to pivot a little bit to that, right? You've alluded to Merck, you mentioned Champions. We want to talk about, you've also worked with AstraZeneca and Bayer, among others. So I'm curious on how you approach those, how you went about getting those partnerships in the first place. A lot of folks in our audience are founders themselves and interested in, attaining those kinds of partnerships. So I'm curious, how you went about getting them in the first place and what you had to achieve to get them in terms of your own model. And then second, once you have a partnership in place, how do you make those successful?
That's a really good question. I mean, I would say that a couple of things mattered, right? One is, this is not going to be a surprise to anybody, but really platform proof. But by the proof, I mean a set of activities that honestly at the time we weren't sure were really worth the effort, but eventually really turned out to be hugely impactful in getting us, like a marquee deal and sort of getting us to the next stage. and we had to go out on a limb to essentially like invest into those relationships as well as validation experiments. So essentially what we did in particular was, build a system that looked promising, spent a couple of years research, like essentially developing the machine learning architecture, and then setting up something that was quasi, it was useful, but it wasn't really that scalable. And also it wasn't that much validated. I mean, we had some interesting early results in various partnerships, but those were all sort of super, super early stage. And so we knew that ultimately what we really needed to show was that we can well predict an experiment, but also that we can actually reveal novel IP in those simulated experiments. Because of course, if you can just recreate something that you can anyways do in a lab, that's not really going to be interesting. We needed to really show that by being able to simulate complex experiments at scale, you as a biologist can really understand biology in a new way, and you are able to uncover sort of novel mechanisms, novel targets, novel disease positioning approaches or combinations. And so we actually raised really our first round of funding to fund not just further tech development and trying to crack through some of the scalability issues we've had in that sort of early section of Turbine's lifetime, but also to invest into the validation and even like some early stage drug discovery efforts around like demonstrating druggability of a set of novel targets that we identify in the simulations. And also we wanted to demonstrate that we could identify novel positioning approaches for existing compounds that weren't so advanced that they were sort of incredibly well known, but really were sort of early in their lifetime. They were just going through that initial translation to the clinic. They were maybe in phase one and developed by like for example, lesser known um, biopharma companies, but we felt that we had an interesting new take on their positioning. And so essentially we spent about 2 to 3 years really focusing on this, as well as keeping, chipping away at the technical scalability issues. And those led us to identify and validate a set of sort of novel targets and biomarkers. And at the time, and we may get to this later when we talk about fundraise, but at the time, this was around like 2020 to 2022 maybe. And so, that was that period where still you could more easily raise for like an AI biotech play, and everybody was getting incredibly excited about AI companies becoming really essentially pipeline focused and essentially drug discovery outfits. And so we kind of launched these efforts in a way to maybe set ourselves up to make that pivot, while really internally debating about whether that makes sense or not. But in a way, we really eventually turned out, we laid the foundation for some of the core deals that would like really start catapulting us towards like product market fit and go to market in the past like year and a half. And so that work that we invested there at risk turned out to be key, as well as some of the early partnerships that we launched, where we were essentially just sharing with organizations like Cancer Research Horizons, where it was hard for us to really figure out how that fit into a business model, but we felt it was cool science, interesting problems, and we felt okay, we could go for that. And the collaboration itself may not have been a huge commercial success, but actually some of the proof points and even the fact that we were working with those companies led us to, for example, our marquee Ono deal last year, which was our first like $100 million plus collaboration on like target ID. So that was sort of a key experience there. So that platform proof was one. The second is we found is really to be able to speak biology, even though of course we've really been very much a focused AI outfit, not a biotech outfit, but we still, even in the founding team, we had 2 out of the 4 of us actually with a biomedical background. And that actually meant that from the get-go, we always had a lot of internal friction, but also a balance between people that wanted better and better predictors that were harder and harder to interpret, and people that wanted predictors that could actually make sense to a biologist and could actually lead to novel insight into the mechanism of disease. And that's something that eventually really helped us, actually, because what we've really gotten as a feedback from any partner we've ever worked with was how competent our science team was, right? That we were really peers to them, not just we weren't just better at them or maybe as good as them as in data science or AI, but we were just as good as them at understanding the biology and the disease that they were trying to better understand and maybe drug. And that built a ton of early trust, even when the platform was much less validated as today. So I think that was a second key point that we sort of logged into, but I think can actually be replicated if somebody really makes sure that the founding team is set up in the right way. And I would say the final thing was that insane focus on what is the user going to do, and what, who is the user really, and what are the problems we can solve for them. Which again, it sounds a bit, I think, out of place in the AI drug discovery field, because most people are sort of really, really, really focused on who has the bigger model, how many parameters do you have, I don't know, how big is the round that you raised, like where your lead program is. These are all understandable, but I think for us it really turned out that it was key to understand what is the struggle of that bench scientist that is asked to whatever better understand that mechanism so the drug can be better positioned in the clinic. And I think that understanding is now really turning out to be pivotal as we build products that the customer can use and the pharma scientist on the other side can use.
And that's going back to your experience at the cybersecurity company that you originally started, right? Like putting yourself in the shoes of the people who are actually going to be using your product.
Closer.
Yeah, that's excellent. And it sounds like that visual lab interface also is a critical piece of it. It's not just having a fancy good AI model. It's, can that model be used to actually drive an experiment forward or inform a clinical development decision or inform a business decision, right? It's great to have, like you mentioned, like a million different parameters and data sets, and those are all important, but at the end of the day, it needs to be usable for folks who are perhaps not AI scientists.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, and it's something that we only really are now seeing the effect of. So, at the beginning of the year, coming out of JPM, we felt that market for virtual cells, biology is really now forming. It's now a thing that people may start looking for, but essentially, as you say, now everybody has cool sounding models, maybe something open source, but really none of this is actually a product. None of this is something that can be used in a real drug discovery context without somebody investing a ton of time into making it work. And so we kind of went out on a limb and decided to open up the internal platform that we've been using for years, right, internally. But it's this very typical internal user interface where biologists can use it, but they have to be at Turbine for whatever a year to be able to really master the way that it works. And so we committed to actually building out a product function, actually bringing in user experience specialty into the team, and actually really rethink the way that the simulations work to make it an actually useful thing. And we launched it in a super narrow area. I mean, we went into the ADC field, and we actually, even within that, started focusing on simulating experiments to test payloads and payload combinations. And that's, compared to everything else we've done, it's incredibly narrow, but it's turning out to be a really good beachhead because we were able to show what simulating biology could be like and how this could fit into your workflow. And now that we can actually show a tangible proof of this, an example, suddenly people really start getting it. And now it's all about, okay, adding in all the other things that we've done, and we can predict well into that platform.
Got it. And I think that's helpful for the folks in our audience who are building AI companies too, is like making sure that you have that user interface ready to go and understand how people are going to use it. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you did raise money at perhaps a slightly easier time for the capital markets as a startup. But you were based in Hungary, and I'm assuming there were challenges in raising that money. So I'm curious if you have any lessons for the entrepreneurs in our audience who are trying to raise money in a tight capital market. It's hard to, VCs aren't as much spending as they have historically. We're recording this in fall of 2025, so has been fairly challenging for early stage biotechs and even AI biotechs to some degree. So I'm curious on any advice you have, having successfully raised a round, on what a startup can do in a challenging market to do that.
Yeah, and actually, funnily enough, I think we only raised in challenging markets, because the first time we started raising was 2020, and I think I sent the first set of emails to initiate conversations with VCs was March, and right around the time when everybody was shutting down. And so those emails were never answered for mostly, but we raised then, and then we raised right after. Actually, we kicked off our Series A in late 21, but really by the time we kind of got anywhere with it, beginning of 22, collapsing markets, Ukraine war, and so like everything essentially went to shit. And then I'm not sure what will happen the next time we really go at fundraising, but everybody should, I don't know, hunker down before that. But I think because of that, as you say, I mean, we really learned like how tough raising can be in like a difficult market, especially when you have the really bad timing that we've had, where you kind of launch in good times and then you race through the course of the crash, which of course means that people may get really excited, but then they sort of pull the brakes really hard. And so, like, I think what we've really seen is, of course, some of the basic stuff where just plan for the race to be much longer than you expected and make sure that you can manage cash accordingly. But that's like, rookie stuff, of course. I mean, everybody tells you that. I think the other thing is what we've seen is sort of like mental resilience in a way. Because we've mental resilience is also like, let's say, strategic resilience, i.e., when we launched either of these, eventually they turned out to be somewhat difficult raises. I think we had the right plan, but when we hit choppy waters because of the markets, of course we had a lot of pressure, both internally as well as, for example, from the board, investors, to really like deviate, right? Okay, why not just focus on the potential lead asset? Why not just really lean into that biotech business model, for example, in the case of the Series A. And I think what really worked out eventually was that we sort of stuck to our guts and said, no, we'll pull back on the number of initiatives we're financing, right? I mean, we'll really, really, really try to manage cash well, but we're kind of doing the core thing that we believe in, and we're not going to change the company just because VCs are suddenly not really looking for, like, I don't know, very, very ambitious projects that are very, very unvalidated in a way when it comes to like the technology at the time, or the market traction, which was even very much true in the Series A as well. So that was one thing that we kind of suffered through and eventually were vindicated in. And the other part was also mental resilience, is just like find a way to handle the pressure as a founder. I mean, I went through some insanely low lows especially during the Series A. And ultimately, I think what sort of won the day was just sort of being able to hang in there somehow, right? I mean, definitely everything was at risk for a while there, like relationships, I don't know, marriage, everything was endangered in a way because it was so tough. And other stuff also happened in my life that made it tough. But I don't know, for example, therapy for a while, like that definitely helped. Good mentors who were at least willing to sometimes pat you on the back. And actually, I think a good founding team that ultimately sort of trusted me to get the job done, even when it looked pretty bleak. And if I lost faith, then at least they over maybe a beer kept some faith in me. Those really helped. And this is very, like a wishy, soft stuff. But what I found is that the soft stuff is what keeps you in the game long enough to then, have a lucky break that most of the fundraise events anyways are, in a way. I mean, you kind of need to get to that one discussion where you find somebody that really believes in that story. Maybe that's the final thing that we were able to, in all of these raises, find people that sort of bought into the vision that we had early, right? And I mean, again, that sounds like 101 stuff, but I found that most VCs, even when they're really great, I'm sure, but most VCs tend to go with the herd. And honestly, up until this point, if you said that you're virtualizing cells, simulating biology with AI, it wasn't sexy. It was more looked at as a bit, cuckoo, right? And so we kind of had to find the few VCs that were sort of, they had their own internal conviction that this may happen. And at least in Europe, we found that to be not so easy. And so, but you can find them. It's just that you kind of have to go through all the difficult discussions, or not difficult. It's just like downer discussions where people absolutely think that you're crazy or believe that your business model sucks, or they believe that your whole technology and premise sucks. So that's something that you can get to, but you need to kind of find the right people to get there.
And you covered a lot of ground there. I think that mental resilience point is definitely one that will resonate with our audience. And also too, it sounds like you need to have a balance, right? Like knowing when to like stick to your guns, double down, and know also too, there may be times where you need to pivot and adjust. It's interesting that you covered about your marriage. I know we're running out of time here, and your mental health, but yeah, startup life isn't for the faint of heart, right? Like you are taking a lot of risk on, and your success is tied to the success of your company. And if it's a challenging market and you can't raise money, that also affects your own personal life. So it's not just, it's not all unicorns and rainbows. It's hard work, and it can be extremely taxing and stressful. I don't know if you have time to cover that just a little bit, like what got you through those tougher moments in your personal life that occurred because of the startup, and how you made it through that. But I think that's something that I think would be really interesting for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, um, yeah, what helped? So I think on the one hand, definitely not therapy in the tough times, but like essentially therapy over years prior to that, which wasn't like it wasn't driven by anything crazy. It was just I don't know, like I lost my dad, and I realized that I was not able to grieve at all. I was just super functional and focused on the rest of my siblings and making sure everything was fine. And then like a friend told me maybe that's something you should think about, because in a way maybe you're not really able to sort of access or realize some of your sort of emotional load. And then I was like, maybe I should think about it. And so I started a therapy process, and that lasted years, but ultimately really helped me better understand some of my own blind spots, which eventually actually really helped me, I think, become a better version of myself. And of course, I often feel like a shitty version of myself, but at least it's somewhat better than what it used to be. But anyway, so like that was one thing that was sort of like setting myself up to have more resilience, because like as always, it's not about like you really I don't know, it's not about sunshine and rainbows after therapy. It's more about like you get to understand yourself a bit better, and so you can be more patient with yourself, and maybe you can see when you're starting to like work in a certain way, or you're starting to exhibit patterns of behavior that are not really going to help you or the company, right? I mean, oftentimes that's what you have to think about, that you have to grow as a person because you're the premier rate limiting step of the company. As if you don't change, then how can the company scale ultimately? So that was one thing. The other was, again, like this is not a huge surprise, but definitely was very, very true for me, is like a partner that was like she's not working in startups, and also she's I think mentally much more stable and emotionally than I am. And when I ultimately was like dating her, I for a while even thought maybe she's too stable, right? I mean, maybe I need more excitement in my life. But ultimately I think I that was maybe my one wise decision in my whole life when it comes to like relationships, that I chose somebody that was like way more stable, much more cheerful, and like just generally be able to stay stable even when I was sort of leaning all over the place. And so that's absolutely helped over the past number of years. And when it comes to sort of more applicable stuff, or like less personal stuff, I think also mentors, to find the people that you look up to, but really like you enough to be actually supportive in the tough times. Because you can get a lot of board members or investors that cheer you on and they love you when things are going well, but of course it's rarer to find somebody that believes in you as a person or the company well enough that they're willing to stick to you and support you in the tough times. And I think actually that also is true, and even maybe even more important when it comes to investors. So I think picking investors that believe in you slash the company well enough that they're not just with you in the good times. And again, this sounds like rookie stuff, but I think it's very easy to make a mistake where somebody's offering you a better deal, or you feel like you kind of need to take a deal, and you don't have the right gut feeling here, but you're willing to risk it. And I found that those relationships often become huge issues when the tough times inevitably hit for all of us sometimes, right? And you have to power through them, and you want somebody that you can be honest with on the board and in your investor syndicate. And you need somebody that actually helps you solve problems instead of being a problem themselves. So I would say some of those really helped in those
Well, I'll
tough
say
times.
the theme I'm hearing is that it's the people you surround yourself with, right? In your case, it's your partner, it's the mentors, it's the right investors that you have a good fit for, and that can provide good counsel in challenging times. It sounds like it's really about
Yeah, and
surrounding
that's
yourself with good people.
like finding those mentors is something that everybody has control over, because of course, like it's easy to give advice where it's like, okay, this is my life and maybe it's not yours, and so it's hard to replicate. But I think actually finding the right mentors slash investors, but definitely the mentors, I found, especially coming out of Hungary with absolutely no network in biopharma, I had none of them, right? But you can actually get access to them. I think people tend to be very open to help you out if you're really excited about what you do, and you respect their time, but you're sort of enthusiastic and you're willing to sort of go out on a limb and ask them to help. I think often what I found is that the most of the time people are surprisingly willing to actually sacrifice their time, often absolutely for free, to actually help out sort of the next generation or somebody that they're really rooting for. And that has been transformative for Turbine, because most of the investment, most of the chances, a lot of the deals that we got came through actually people that we sort of reached out to or built a relationship with over time, and then they became SAB members or board members or investors. So I think that's something that everybody can do, actually.
Fantastic. I know we're running short on time, so I'll give you this one chance. Do you want to say anything else, any last words of wisdom, especially to the founders in our audience who are going to be trying to follow in your footsteps?
Yeah, what would be a good learn? Yeah, so I think what I would say is um, maybe two things, maybe three things. One is, at least these are very much like lessons I learned over time and could be useful for somebody else. So here goes. One is that no single thing can kill you. And what I mean by that is, at least for me, oftentimes I feel like if something's going wrong, it can feel like, oh my God, like that's 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. Like if this doesn't work out, if this deal doesn't come through, if this investor says no, then it's all over. At least I often feel like that, even today, but definitely in the past. And what I found, I mean, we've been building Turbine together for like 10 years, and maybe over the past 5 years, we really started raising funds and sort of, accelerating the whole team build and everything. And all throughout those times, there were a million points in time when I felt that it was all sort of, on a knife's edge. And looking back, you're like, actually, it didn't really matter that much. And I'm not saying, like, of course, a lot of things can kill you as a young company and as a founder, but I found that there's way more resilience in things than one assumes. And so I'm trying nowadays to be more conscious of this. And when I feel like something's going wrong, just to be able to compartmentalize it, I guess, and put it on a shelf and feel like, okay, fine, so this is going wrong, like what's going right? Even if this doesn't happen, something else may very well. So that can sometimes help with also the mental load, at least for me. The second one is, I think, in a way, to not be so wedded to let's say your own worldview or your ideas of yourself. And this is also very personal, but I found that over the course of my life, there were a lot of like very strong beliefs I held about what makes me great, right? Like what makes me great or special. And it's this thing, or it's the thing that I never sleep, or it's the thing that I always, go the extra mile and like never stop. And there were a lot of these like little stories that, one tells oneself, I guess. And I found that oftentimes the thing that you feel is the best thing about you turns out to be actually like the worst thing, especially as you grow and as the company grows. They can often become much more hindrances than the thing that actually really powers the company or your success. And so I think like being able to and actively sort of challenging your own beliefs and worldviews, that really is very, very important as a founder, because you need to really grow as a person and change the way you see the world. Otherwise, you'll get sort of left behind, even by the company, if it succeeds, right? I think that's one. And then, in a way, and this was very true for Turbine, where it's cool that you're a pioneer, because we thought of virtual cells 10 years ago, and we legit coined the word and worked on it and all that. But as I mentioned, really for most of our lifetime, people looked at us as if we were crazy for trying to do this. And also, like, it was very, very hard to make it work. And so I think it was often very hard to drown out the noise and to try to build not just a new tech, but also a new business model, instead of sort of following the more trodden path of like saying, okay, we'll actually become a biotech company, we'll build a drug pipeline because people really like believe in that, whereas nobody believes you can make successful large business in biopharma if you're focusing on software or technology sales. That has been true for a long time. It's now starting to change, but again, for most of our lifetime, people started believing in it and really held that almost dogmatic view. So I think being able to drown out the noise when people really don't believe in what you're building, that's something else that you have to do. Of course, it's always hard, right? Because it's sometimes you're drinking your own Kool-Aid, and so it's hard to sort of differentiate between the two, and it's easy to be close to feedback, maybe too close to feedback. But I think generally, especially when it comes to investors or partners, you kind of have to suffer through a lot of people that think you're an idiot before you really start to understand what even a good partner looks like, what you have, how to build something they want, etc. And I think finally, something that again I mentioned really helped us, getting those mentors, getting those partners, is like just dare to ask for help and feel free to sort of feel stupid, or allow yourself to feel stupid. And I can tell you, even today I feel stupid in most of the discussions I go to, and in most of the I don't know, events or meetings or wherever you go to, because of course I'm not a specialist in almost any of the fields that we work in. But you often find that you can make sort of a lot out of that. Actually, it can be a huge advantage, because of course you can sort of transfer learnings and combine things in a different, a new way. But still, I think, like, especially as a new founder, I think one often feels incompetent in many different situations. And I think being able to go out and get help for that, like ask people stupid questions and just allow yourself to be that uncomfortable, is key actually to succeed.
Fantastic. Well, that's wonderful advice, and I think our audience is going to learn a lot from this episode. So, Szabi, thank you so much for joining the Nucleate podcast.
It's been great, Sam. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.